everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. Hope you're all well. Welcome to the Angus Essentials webinar series, and we're up to webinar number 3. First of all, apologies for the delay from last week. As they refer to in the AFL, I was out with the health and safety protocol, but we're all back on deck now and very excited to be bringing you this 3rd instalment of the Angus Essentials webinar series. Tonight, I have the great pleasure, and we have the pleasure to be joined by Jen Peart. Are you there, Jen?
Yes, here you're really giving away your origins, referring to AFL. But hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us, and yeah, hopefully you get a good, a lot out of this session.
Thanks, Jen. Jen's our Northern Development Officer based in Injune in Central Queensland, which is a long way away from where I am in South Australia. But thanks everyone for joining us and making time tonight. We also are joined by Andrew Byrne, the Genetic Evaluation Manager at Angus Australia, which is a great pleasure to have Andrew along. Andrew won't be necessarily presenting tonight, but you'll get to meet Andrew next month at the webinar number 4, which is going to be all about genotyping. So it's a great pleasure to have Andrew along. My name's Jake Phillips. I'm the Extension Manager at Angus Australia. It gives me great pleasure to be bringing you this webinar series. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we kick off. If you do have any questions throughout the night, please put them in the chat. That would be our ideal method, or raise your hand, which is the one of the features in the Zoom webinar that we're on. Or of course, you can send it to either Jen or myself directly, either tonight or offline, and we'll certainly follow up for you. I do need to let you know that we are recording this webinar, and it will be available on YouTube in the following days, probably from early next week. And you'll be able to view the rest of the webinar series there as they do come to fruition. If there's any further points of clarification about anything that we discussed tonight, please visit the Angus Education Centre as part of the Angus Australia website, or of course, get in contact with Angus Australia staff, and we'll be able to point you in the right direction to the person that will be able to best quell and answer your queries. And just to also let you know that we do have a short poll at the start and at the end of this presentation, and that's really essential for your feedback so we can make this kind of engagement better as the year progresses, and also planning for next year. So thanks a lot. Tonight we're going to be talking about genetic evaluation. We're going to be talking about, we're also going to be talking about the TACE evaluation, which is the Trans-Tasman Angus cattle evaluation, and a bit about performance recording as well, which is such a huge part of the life, but also the business of raising registered Angus cattle, and many people choose to adopt that genetic evaluation technology. So without any further ado, we might get stuck into it. So just a reminder, if you haven't joined us previously, this is part of a series that will run through till September. And as I alluded to, next month we will be joined by Andrew again, and be delving a little bit deeper into the DNA technology sphere that we do work in, and be able to talk about the DNA pipeline, genomics, parent verification, and also monitoring those genetic conditions that we monitor at Angus Australia. So that's going to be really a nice webinar next month. We'll then in August go into some examples of how to use Angus Tech and Angus Select to find those individual animals that are listed for sale or just within our database, and some of the cool features that we've been able to put together at Angus Australia to satisfy some of the requests that we've had from members, but also showcase some of the functionality of that industry-leading software. In September, Jen will be joining us to take us through what is a successful AI program, and we're going to be very fortunate to be joined by some of the industry leaders in that space in September, and we'll round out the series with a little bit of sale preparation, hints and tips, and how Angus Australia can help you in that aspect of your business to showcase the genetics that you've got within your portfolio. So without any further ado, we might get stuck into it.
Thanks again for joining us, everyone, for this third edition of Angus Essentials, where we're going to be looking at the genetic evaluation in the Angus breed that we refer to as the TACE analysis, or the Trans-Tasman Angus Cattle Evaluation. So looking ahead at what's coming up in the webinar series after tonight, we've got on the 7th of July the DNA technology session, which is going to be an overview of the use of DNA technology and around genomics and parent verification and testing for genetic conditions within the Angus population. In August, we get into Angus Select, which is using Angus Select to find animals and animals for sale, genetics for sale, and also a look at the reporting functions available through Angus Select. And then in September, we move into running a successful AI program, and we've got a fantastic range of speakers for that 8th of September session, so don't miss that one. And we're going to round out this series at the end of September with just a bit of information and presentation from our marketing and communications experts around preparing for your sale and a guide to marketing and advertising with Angus Australia. So don't miss that. But for now, let's get into the TACE analysis and an overview of what it is, when to use it, and how to get the most out of it. So in tonight's session, we're going to be covering 4 main aspects to this evaluation, and we're going to start off with, why are we even discussing performance recording? Why do we have the TACE analysis? We're going to take a bit of a deeper dive into what the TACE analysis is, and we're going to also start to look at creating a performance recording strategy for your breeding program. So the challenge. Let's start with the big picture. The real challenge for us as beef producers, and indeed food producers in this country and more broadly across the world, is that the world population is predicted to hit 10 billion people by 2050. Now, that's just over 25 years' time from now. With that increasing population, we're also going to have inadequate food supply. And if you look at just the last couple of years, we even had 10% more inadequate food supply by definition compared to 2019. So in that 12-month period, we actually seen a huge decrease in the amount of food available, which we would call adequate supply, across the world. So generally, we've got diminishing resources, diets are changing. Some economies and countries are eating more beef or eating beef in different ways. Others are certainly eating less meat. And we've also got more erratic weather events and different elements across the world which are impacting the supply and demand. So we need to get much better at managing these two things, the genetics and the environment. In fact, we need to get better than we ever have before. So where does this really start? And this is where we kind of left off in session 1 of the Angus Essentials webinar series, and it really is looking at the variation that exists across our Angus population. We've of course got variation across breeds on various different aspects of phenotypes and genotypes. We've also got variation within breed across the Angus population. So let's start with a quick little test. Just if you've got a notepad and a pen nearby, who thinks that there is variation in the Angus breed? And we're going to have a little poll on this. So Jen, if you'd like to hit the poll button, we'll put the poll up. We'll start with birth weight and go through a few of the weight traits. What we're asking for is, how much variation do you think exists between sires that are in the top 10% of the breed for that trait versus sires that are in the bottom 10% of the breed for that trait? How much variation in the progeny are we likely to see? So what we can see is that there is significant variation in the Angus population in progeny that come from sires from the top 10% of certain traits to the lower 10% of certain traits. And this is an example that's came out of the Angus Eye benchmarking program. So a trait such as birth weight, we've actually got 4.4 kilograms of variation between those sires in the progeny that we've physically recorded. We've got 20 kilos of weaning weight or 200-day weight, which is significant considering the price of beef at the moment and what that difference in terms of dollar terms could actually be. We've got 46 kilos of difference in carcass weight, and we've got 147 units of MSA marbling difference, which is a huge contribution to that change in MSA index score of 2.2. Now that is significant. So across the variation of these traits, we can certainly see that there are major differences in the variation across the Angus population. And that's a good thing for calculating the genetics available for us to be able to select on to improve in certain traits. So really, the key to a successful animal breeding enterprise is the accurate description of the genetic differences and the use of these differences to breed the next generation. So let's just start with, how much do we think we know about an animal by looking at it? Some might say a fair bit. Others that know a few things might be able to say we don't know much about that animal at all, and that's actually probably closer to the truth. But when we start to evaluate the pedigree of this animal in terms of who is the sire, who is the dam, and any other relatives that are in the granddam or grandsire position, we start to know a little bit about this animal. When we then include birth details as well, such as how many calves were born within that birth, was it a single born or a twin or even a triplet? What day was it born on, so we then know how old the animal it is. How old was its mum when it was born? Was it a first calf heifer or an 8-year-old cow? And there's a variety of other different aspects that when we include the birth details, we actually know a little bit more about the animal that we're looking at. Over time, we can also include some performance data, and these things might be such as a birth weight or a calving ease score. They could then include a weaning weight at approximately 200 days of age, and a yearling weight at approximately 400 days of age. We can then also include things like docility or scrotal circumference and even scanning measurements. And the combination of all of these performance data points collected will actually start to give us a bit better idea of how much we know about that animal and the likelihood of the genetics that they are going to be passing on to their progeny. We can then also include genomic testing, or a test on the DNA to see what genes this animal is carrying and compare those genes to other animals in the Angus population. This then lets us know a little bit more about this animal than we did previously. And we also then can start to include information on relatives. Now, this might be sisters and brothers within the herd and indeed across other herds within the breed. It could be cousins, granddams, grandsires, and distant relatives that are also included in this genetic evaluation. But we start to get the best idea of what this animal looks like and its genetic merit and contribution to the breeding program when we start to get information on progeny. And this is really the step that animals take when we start to talk about them becoming proven and have a higher accuracy of estimated breeding values or a higher confidence level of the genetic merit that they are carrying. So why are we discussing performance recording? It comes down to three main reasons. The first one is to define the genetic differences in performance between animals and particularly their progeny. We also then need to use this information to make decisions on the next generation of calves, and as cattle breeders, we're the custodians of that decision. And the third point is we really need to increase the predictability and accuracy of this information, because if we can be more predictable with a higher level of accuracy amongst that information we're using, we can make more genetic gain sooner within our breeding program. We might just pause there very briefly to see if there's any initial questions on the webinar tonight. We will, of course, have a longer session period at the end of the seminar, but if there's anything burning right now would be a great time to ask or put into the chat.
How's the chat looking there, Jen? And sorry about the sound, everyone. I think we've finally got that worked out. We're only bush tech people, but hopefully we're getting closer. Is there any burning questions there, Jen?
Not yet, but I will, guys, send them in via the group chat or raise your hand, and if we don't touch on them now, we can touch on them at the next break for questions or at the end. So flick them through and we'll make sure we get your questions covered.
All right, sounds great. Let's keep going.
So let's just circle back to something we discussed in webinar 1, but we're going to dive into much more detail now. What is an EBV, or an estimated breeding value? Well, it is an estimated breeding value, and it provides a prediction of the breeding value or genetic merit of an animal for individual traits. Really what we're after here is the true breeding value of an animal. But we have to use all of the tools and resources available that we know about this animal and its genes that it's carrying to calculate how close we can get to that true breeding value, and hence the wording, the estimated breeding value. It's calculated from pedigree, performance and genomic information supplied by Angus Australia members. An estimated breeding value needs to be compared. So in this example between bull A and bull B, we have bull A with an EBV of plus 60 kilograms for 200 day weight, and bull B with an EBV of plus 40 kilograms for 200 day weight. Now, what we need to do here is compare the difference in performance of the progeny between these two bulls. And what we will find that the calves at 200 days of age, given that 50% of the genes come from sire A and 50% of the genes come from sire B in this example, that the calves from sire A are going to be 10 kilos difference and heavier at weaning compared to the calves from bull B. And one of the key points I'd like to make is that EBVs belong to the progeny, meaning that when you go and look at a bull for sale and you look at the EBVs about him, what that really is indicating is the likelihood of those genetics being passed on to his progeny and the difference that will exist between sires reflected in the progeny. They don't necessarily describe the individual animal, in this case a bull, that you're looking at. They are describing the difference in the progeny performance. And so EBVs aren't describing that individual's performance. Therefore, you can't assess the animal's actual weight for age to his growth EBVs. And we had a question in webinar 1 about what is a benchmark weaning weight for an Angus steer in the Angus population. And that's not something we can provide because the EBVs aren't there to actually assess the actual weight. It's about describing the difference between the progeny. And what they do is that EBVs take out the non-genetic factors to enable the comparison of individuals fairly and without bias. And this is really mainly referring to the environment in which those cattle have been raised, which includes animal health as well. So without this, we're really just more than likely going to be selecting older animals or animals that have been raised in a more favourable environment because they will typically look better. But that's not a true indication of the genetics playing their part. EBVs will become more accurate when we get more information on the animal. More performance records, we know more information about the relatives in the pedigree, and we may also know some information around the genomic results or the genes that that animal is carrying and those that they have in common with other animals within the database. So what we will find that when we have young animals, that their EBVs are likely to change because they will have lower accuracy. They're generally unproven and there's some noise within the predictability. Now that's okay, it's still our best tool to be using, but what we will find is when we get sires, particularly AI sires that have had several hundred or even thousands of calves, their accuracy will start to reach more than 75% and may well creep up into the 90th percentile for accuracy. And all that means is that they're less likely to then change as more progeny are recorded. But what you'll find is that when you're using young sires or young dams that have not had many progeny recorded or had performance submitted for the TACE evaluation, they will likely be at a lower accuracy. And although that is our best tool in prediction at that time, as more information becomes available to the evaluation, there could be some changes over time. And this is what it looks like. We'll have an EBV, but these bars are referred to as standard error bars. And I don't want to get too technical tonight, but effectively the width of that bar is indicating how much chance there is that that EBV could move within that standard error bar. And so the higher accuracy on this slide is indicating that there is far more accuracy and confidence within that prediction of the EBV, and they are less likely to change over time. So I just wanted to touch on how genomics will enhance your EBVs. So how genomics works is that it links your animals to the performance recording data of animals that share that DNA in common. And most commonly in Australia, we have a fantastic reference population called the Angus Australia benchmarking program. Now the ASBP has been running for 12 years and we have between 1,500 and 2,000 calves born every year, mated to, there's 30 to 40 Angus sires mated to roughly 2,000 Angus cows. And the progeny of those matings are what we call intensively recorded, meaning that the majority of phenotypes that can be recorded for traits of interest to us are, and we also collect a DNA sample on those progeny, which then goes into the evaluation and we get a genotype. So we have this intensively recorded population that has both a phenotype and a genotype recorded, and that gives us a great linkage and comparison for other animals in the population that may only have a phenotype or a genotype recorded. What genomics will likely do to your EBVs is increase the selection accuracy of your breeding decisions, and this is because it is due to an increase in the information used in the breeding values calculation. So for some traits they may not move at all. For some traits you will see an increase in accuracy of that trait. And the other key reason that genomics may be used, and certainly enhancing your EBVs, is that it provides information earlier in the animal's life, and particularly on hard to measure traits. We're going to circle back to genomics and all things DNA in the next session of the Angus Essentials webinar series, and the Genetic Improvement Manager Andrew Byrne is going to guide us through that session, and that's going to be a great one not to be missed. So we've spoken a bit about EBVs, and I just wanted to capture this, that EBVs do reliably predict the genetic differences. And this is some data out of the Angus Australia benchmarking program, which we have done a number of times. So here's some traits on the left that, given the EBVs of the sires that we've used between, say, the top sires and the bottom sires in terms of their ranking for that trait, and what the expected difference was in terms of actual measurements. And on the right hand column, this is the actual difference that we recorded. So, for example, we expected a difference of 1.9 kilograms difference in birth weight, and we actually found 1.5 kilograms difference. For weaning weight, we expected 8.7 kilograms difference, and we actually found 8.6 kilograms difference. For carcass rib fat, we expected 1.8 millimeters in difference, and we actually found 1.8 millimeters of difference. And you can see across the traits that really the EBVs do reliably predict the genetic differences across the progeny. So this is a nice little proof of concept example that gives some weight to using EBVs as a reliable prediction tool. So let's just have a look at the TACE evaluation in a little bit more detail. We have more than 20 traits that are available for use within the evaluation that have an EBV reported as part of that standard evaluation that occurs every fortnight across the year. There are growth traits, which include 2, 4 and 600 day weights and mature cow weight, and milk, which is the maternal prediction of growth. We also have fertility traits, carcass traits, feed efficiency traits, structural soundness traits, birth traits, and even other traits such as docility. And so the TACE evaluation, or the Trans-Tasman Angus Cattle Evaluation, is a genetic evaluation program that has been adopted by Angus Australia for Angus and Angus-influenced beef cattle. It uses BLUP technology, which is the best linear unbiased prediction, and promise me that's as technical as we're going to get tonight, but it is a world-leading technology that is an estimate for the genetic differences between animals and is widely used across industry. And the results of this evaluation are published EBVs. So what EBVs are published? Well, we have 21 estimated breeding values routinely reported. We also have 4 research breeding values, and research breeding values are breeding values that we don't have enough information on yet or are still under construction. And these might be traits that we're asking breeders to submit information on, so we can build a nice database of information for our genetic evaluation, which one day we will be able to have a higher level of confidence and accuracy on to include in the routine reporting of EBVs. But at the moment, we are still calculating the accuracy to these, and they're still under construction. We also have 10 selection indexes reported routinely, with 2 that appear in the standard EBV reports, which many of you would be familiar with. And this is what they look like. So this is just a screen grab from the May Trans-Tasman Angus Cattle Evaluation for the EBVs and indexes reported on any certain animal within the TACE evaluation. Across the columns, we've got the different trait types, such as calving ease, growth and fertility. The next level down, we've got the individual traits, which is then followed by the actual EBV for that trait. We've also then got the accuracy being reported for that trait, and we spoke about accuracy just a few slides ago. The PERC, which is the percentage where that animal sits in terms of the percentile, or where it sits in terms of the in reference to the rest of the Angus population. And we've then also got a progeny. We've got a progeny row within the columns, and that's referring to how many progeny have actually been recorded for those traits. So that's a really good indication to see that how much information has actually gone into this evaluation. So for example, on this particular animal for calving ease direct, there's been more than 1,100 individual records analysed within the TACE evaluation. And when we scan across to something like days to calving, there's only been 1. So you can also see that the accuracy for calving ease direct is sitting at 94% accuracy, which is highly accurate, whereas days to calving is sitting in that 62 percentile accuracy range, which is low to moderate accuracy. And that's a reflection of how much information has been included and recorded on these traits amongst its progeny and relatives within the pedigree. These are the 10 standard Angus indexes that are calculated every fortnight, and they include the Angus breeding index, the domestic index, the heavy grain index, the heavy grass index, and then we also have a range of indexes which also have a less of a value on the feed available, and we can talk offline a little bit further about some of these indexes and which one might apply to you. But effectively, if you're self-replacing herd, you'll have a value of the feed that you are providing those animals each year, and that would be through your pasture growth and what it costs you to do that, and also supplementary feeding. And there's some differences across Australia with, I suppose, how much value individual producers put on that feed. We've also then got an index for some New Zealand breeders called the Angus Pro Index, and we've also got an Angus Terminal Sire Index, which is referring to I suppose progeny that are all going to be turned off. There will be no progeny kept as self-replacing females within the herd. This is another way that the EBVs and indexes are reported on individual animals within the TACE evaluation. I particularly like this graph. I think that it's very user-friendly and gives you a great snapshot of where this animal's sitting in terms of its percentiles for each trait. So the way to read this graph, and this is all available on Angus Tech through Angus Select, or finding an individual animal online, and this information will be available. The first column on the left is the trait descriptor and what the EBV is and the title. The next column is referring to the difficulty, and then the far right column is the opposite, or the opposing desirability. And so what this is saying really is that the column to the right is indicating more desirable outcomes generally for those traits, and the column on the left is describing less desirable outcomes for those traits. The line down the middle of this graph, which is the percentile graph, is the 50th percentile, and that's effectively the average of the breed. Across the axis at the bottom, we've got 100 on the left and 0 on the right, and this is just reiterating those less desirable and more desirable aspects I spoke about. And so a push to the right, and the coloured columns sitting to the right, are indicating that these EBVs are sitting in the more desirable percentile of the breed. So if we take example, the very first yellow bar, which is the Calving Ease Direct right at the top of the screen, this is actually sitting in more than the 20th percentile. It's more likely to be around the 15th percentile, which means that there are effectively 85% of the Angus animals within the evaluation which are somewhat less desirable than this animal for Calving Ease Direct EBV. And we can then compare this against, say, the rump fat EBV, which is more lower down towards the center of your screen, and that's sitting at around the 92nd percentile, which means that there are effectively 98% of Angus animals that will have an EBV that are likely to be more desirable or higher for that EBV. And so this is a really great, easy to read snapshot of where that animal is sitting in relation to the rest of the breed. So I just want to quickly take you through the estimated breeding values, and we're not going to go over these in full detail, but across the estimated breeding values in that birth type category, we've got Calving Ease Direct, Calving Ease Daughters, birth weight, gestation length, and the descriptions on the left with these dot points are indicating what's more desirable for that EBV. So, for example, higher Calving Ease Direct EBVs will indicate that an animal is expected to produce fewer calving difficulties in 2-year-old heifers, so therefore greater calving ease. And you can follow along the top dot points as we work through these different slides. The growth EBVs, again, the higher 200, 400 and 600 day growth EBVs will indicate that an animal is expected to produce progeny with heavier live weights at 200, 400 and 600 days of age. Importantly, I'll just pick out the milk EBV on this one. Higher milk EBVs indicate the animal is expected to produce daughters that have heavier calves at 200 days of age due to superior maternal attributes, or the ability to feed that calf more adequately and contribute to a higher weaning weight due to the influence of the cow. Across the fertility traits, we've got higher scrotal sizes, which will indicate the animals to expect to produce sons with larger scrotal circumferences yearlings and daughters that reach puberty earlier. Across the carcass EBVs, again, higher EMA EBVs will indicate that the animal is expected to produce progeny with larger eye muscle areas relative to carcass weight. For example, also higher IMF EBVs will indicate that the animal is expected to produce progeny with a higher percentage of intramuscular fat, therefore marbling, in a 400 kilo carcass. Feed efficiency EBVs, we don't have a lot of this data coming in, but what we do generally is very good by some particular herds. And this is really around lower NFI EBVs indicate that the animal is expected to produce progeny that eat less feed per day relative to their weight and rate of weight gain. And some of the other EBVs we've got are things like docility, where a higher docility EBV will indicate an animal is expected to produce a higher percentage of progeny with acceptable temperament. And that really is a key here, that some of these EBVs are not necessarily linear, but say for this example, it's really referring to that there's a percentage of those progeny that will improve or get to a more desirable level. And that's very similar to also for the structural EBVs, such as a lower clawser EBV will indicate that an animal is expected to produce progeny with more desirable claw structure, being toes that are symmetrical, even, and appropriately spaced. And we've gone over those very quickly, just as a point of time available tonight, but I would like to make these slides available to you, and of course we are recording tonight, which will be available on the Angus YouTube channel very shortly, and we of course do have the Angus TACE analysis collection guidelines and some supplementary resources available for understanding the TACE evaluation. And probably the best place I can direct you to is the Angus Education Centre as part of the Angus Australia website, which has got a full breadth and in-depth information on all of the things we're covering tonight. So after these traits and pedigree and performance information has been evaluated in the TACE evaluation, we then publish this information on Angus Tech, which is really our online database where members of the public and members and registered users of Angus Tech, I should add, can jump on and look at the different EBVs and rankings and percentiles and indexes for all of these animals that we've been describing. Importantly, this is updated on animals each analysis, which at the moment is every fortnight of the year. We then also publish reports for herds that have submitted this information, which includes an EBV extended file. We also then update herds each analysis, which includes an exclusion report, and that's really around what information or what animal has had something submitted which doesn't seem normal compared to the rest of the mob that he was compared against. Now, this could be an absolutely superstar calf that has weaned off at 480 kilograms and the rest of your weaners are 320, and the system will say, there's something not quite right here. Can you please confirm? And that animal will appear as a outlier, which you will need to confirm back with Angus Australia that that is true and correct, or in fact may well have been a typo, or maybe that calf was part of a show team and it was on a cow having supplementary feed, and so there's a logical reason why that calf is weaned early. Alternatively, you could also have a sick calf that is weaned very light compared to the rest of the mob, and what we need to do is flag that in the evaluation, and we'll come back to that in just a little while. We can then also have exclusions for genotypes, which will be picked up in the exclusion report for the genotypes, and that could be something where there's something not quite right, where with the sample, the DNA sample, where it's been transcribed incorrectly in terms of the animal identifying number. It could be something wrong with the sample, or there's a mismatch within the system. And so that's really important to refer back to these reports every fortnight or after you've submitted more information to ensure that the system hasn't picked up one of your animals with the information that you've submitted that has been an issue, because when it sits in these reports, it's actually excluded from the evaluation, and that's not what we want. We want as many animals with as many records as we possibly can to be in that evaluation to give us more accuracy in the information we're using. Every quarter, we also produce reports, which is, around the sire summary report, the genetic benchmarking report, and also some other R&D type reports which may be of interest to some members. These are all available through your online download files section as part of Angus Tech, and we would certainly encourage you to explore that when you can. And if you need any assistance with that, please contact Angus Australia, and we would be more than happy to be able to help you out with that. So I just want to circle back to selection indexes now. We've spoken about EBVs in a bit more depth, and I just want to cover selection indexes as well. So just briefly, a selection index is an economic index value reported as an EBV that is presented as a dollar difference per cow joint. And that dollar difference is not just to the producer, the cow-calf producer, but that's to the supply chain. So it also takes into account the value that that animal and its progeny are contributing further down the line to the feedlot, to the processor, and to the branded beef product as well. And they're also production system specific. So if you're a self-replacing herd, there's a very different comparison for you than if you're a terminal producer using Angus genetics to turn off heavy vealers or whatever your market system might be. So the selection indexes are economic selection indexes reflecting differences in profitability as a result of the animal's genetics. And each selection index is specific to a breeding system, target market, and production system. And they better cater for a diversity that exists across Australia and across the various production systems that we have within our members' areas where they're producing cattle and running their businesses. There are two selection indexes that are reported as standard EBVs, and they are the Angus Breeding Index and the Angus Breeding Index with low feed costs. The other indexes are available from Angus Australia, and we showed those online a few slides ago, where you can access those through Angus Tech. And really, this is about breeders having the option of whether to include selection indexes in their marketing materials. The indexes really are a breeding decision tool, and a tool that you can use to help rank animals based on your particular production system. And you will find some seed stock members do include their indexes within their marketing material, because it is, I suppose, a quick and easy way to see where that particular animal sits in terms of the comparing it against the rest of the Angus population. So just as an example, some of the weightings that, or the trait contribution to those two indexes that I've spoken about, the Angus Breeding Index and the Angus Breeding Index low feed cost, is that the difference here around that cost of feed that I alluded to just a few slides ago is picked up in the mature cow weight. And that's really around that if you're a self-replacing herd, your mature cows are the asset of your herd. They're something that you're going to be looking after 365 days of the year, and you've really invested a lot of time and resources and money into maintaining that cow herd. But what happens with that cow herd is if they start to get larger over time and you don't restrain or contain mature cow weight, those cows will get bigger and they will actually require more feed just as a maintenance cost in order to maintain their body mass and weight. So the low feed cost index here is putting less emphasis on restraining that, and so effectively with the $AL index on the right, what will happen if you keep selecting on growth and don't also balance that with a reduction in mature cow weight, the cows will end up getting bigger and therefore feed costs will increase. The index on the left, which is $A, is a very similar index, but the main emphasis here is that there is actually 17% or 12% extra weighting on that mature cow weight to restrain it, and effectively trying to keep that mature cow weight closer to where you currently are, and not letting that mature cow weight get heavier or larger as the generations unfold, and therefore trying to keep a cap on feed costs. Importantly, when we compare that against the selection advantage, we actually start to see that there is very little differences between the two indexes apart from mature cow weight. And we can see that along the bottom here where that MCW is, which is mature cow weight. The graph on the left, which is that $A, which is the one that had the increased emphasis on the mature cow weight, is showing that by selecting on this index, you're having effectively a net no difference or even a slight decrease in the amount of mature cow weight genetically that you're going to be contributing to your breeding herd. Whereas the difference on the right, because you're not placing as much emphasis on that particular trait, that mature cow weight is actually increasing over time as you select on more growth. And you can see now with that red box that's been highlighted exactly what I've been referring to. So one of the first things that I would certainly encourage new breeders to do, or for those that have been doing it for a while and just would like to revisit some of the concepts, is to certainly align yourself with one of the indexes that Angus Australia has available. And you could look at it as, are you a self-replacing herd or are you a terminal herd? And that's probably the first question to answer. The next question is, within your production system, is pasture fully utilised for the majority of the year? And if it is, then effectively your feed costs are going to be, if you are going to increase the amount of cows you're running or they're going to require more feed, that comes as a direct cost to your business. If the system where your production system where you're running your farm is not fully utilising the majority of feed for the year, meaning you might have 6 or 9 months of the year where you have surplus feed, then having a few more cattle or having cattle that require more feed may not come as a direct cost to your business, and that's okay. Then refer to the mature cow weight objective as well, and whether you're trying to maintain mature cow weight, meaning that you're happy where the mature weight of your cows is genetically, or you don't want to maintain mature cow weight, and that means that you're happy if your cows get a little larger. And so then that will point you to the direction of a number of indexes, and the list on the left is effectively the Angus Breeding Index, the Domestic Index, and the Heavy Grain and Grass Indexes, which have also contribution to that type of market, whether you're supplying cattle or your clients are supplying cattle for a domestic feedlot or a longer feedlot grain feeding system, or finishing cattle off of grass. And very similar on the right, except these people are more than happy to have slightly larger cows or increase their feed costs in order to hit their production goals. And again, this is how the indexes are reported through the Angus Tech database. So why is it important not to just select on an individual index and actually have some criteria around EBVs? So this example is showing that these two animals are actually rating in the top 1 percentile at $303 on the $A index. But there are significant differences between these animals when it comes back to the EBVs. And remember, this is because the index is an overall rating, an economic rating, and so there's different contributing factors to that. Whereas for this particular example, there's a major difference in calving ease direct, which we can see on the left-hand side. One of these animals, the one on the left, is sitting at about the 75th percentile for the breed, and the other is sitting at about the top 10 percentile for the breed. There's also significant differences in mature cow weight. One is in the top 30th percentile, and the other one is closer to breed average. And there's also significant differences in fat EBV as well, with some of these fat EBVs on the left sitting in the 90th percentile or even less desirable, and the one on the right is actually more desirable than breed average. So there are significant differences in some of the traits that are important. So it's important to go, after you've used the index as a bit of a filtering tool, to ensure that the individual EBVs are going to line up with your breeding objective. And that's really what we covered in that first session of Angus Essentials. So I suppose just in summary for TACE, why do we even have TACE? And, you know, we've covered a lot in this last 10-minute session of EBVs and indexes. But really what TACE is doing is to evaluate the genetic differences between animals. It's teasing out, after we make some assumptions about the environment and how these cattle have been raised and you know, their nutrition and health and things like that, the difference that's left is genetics. And this is evaluating the difference between those animals. It's also to provide an easy to use and easy to understand tool to make more informed decisions as to the animal's true breeding value. And at the end of the day, it's to maximise the rate of genetic improvement within your herd, but also the beef industry more generally. We've covered a lot of information there. Are there any questions right now? Or if there's not, we will keep marching on and get to the last session.
How we're looking there, Jen, a lot of info, and I'm sure there'll be some things that people think about later tonight. But is there any burning questions we can cover?
There are a number of questions that have come through. So are you happy if we hit all of them just now and we'll carry on? Oh, is it a bit of a break?
Yeah, let's give our best shot. We've still got a little bit to go, but if there's a couple there particularly relevant to what we've just gone through, let's have a crack.
Righto. So we'll start with one from Mark. Mark has asked, what is the ID of the beast with these EBVs? He was referring to the one that had the 4,000 progeny analysed.
Sorry, I just missed the question. What is the point of...
What is the ID of the beast with the EBVs that you displayed?
Well, I can probably provide that too, but Mark, if you want to have a bit of a practice on Angus Tech, one of the features that we can actually do is sort by the number of progeny records as well in the extended view once you're a registered user, and that's available to all registered users. So I would encourage you to have a play with some of the filtering features because you will be able to pull up how many progeny or sort size by how many progeny they've had, and then obviously look across at what traits they fall into as well.
Very politically correct. Loved how you stepped to that one. That's great. Don had a question, and unfortunately he has had to go. He would like to find out how the environment impacts on EBVs, especially in different regions. He is based in WA, where they've just started their AI program and put the bulls in for their commercial cows. Essentially, feed availability, weather conditions during the early life of calves, food availability during finishing, etc. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, we're going to talk a bit about environment in this next little chapter before the end of the webinar, so I won't give too much away, but effectively how the evaluation works is looking for the differences in between progeny across all of the data we get. And of course, we're going to get, you know, if we say particularly AI sires that are going to be well used, it's highly likely that they're going to have progeny being recorded in Southeast Queensland, all through New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia and Western Australia. So we're going to get a range of environments, and what the evaluation is looking for is some similarities between those progeny that is being contributed by the sire or by the dam, so the genetic influence. And the evaluation actually teases out that difference that is consistent and puts aside all of the other noise, which is things like the environment or what condition or health the cows were in. So it's unlikely that any one particular herd would have too much influence long term on the EBVs of a certain animal once we start to get well recorded progeny across all states. And that's, of course, will be reflected in the accuracy of that EBV as well.
Perfect. Lachlan has asked, are there any tests that you can do to prove it is a full-blood Angus cow if you have no papers?
Yes, there is. I would encourage you to talk to us offline, but we have some commercial products available. One is called Angus Heifer Select. And as part of that commercial DNA product, there's also a feature as part of your results, which is called breed check, and that will actually report back a breed component, particularly looking for the percentage of Angus of that animal, as well as some other breeds as well. And we're finding that we're getting great interest in that product from commercial breeders looking to establish how much Angus content there are of replacement females generally, but there would be no reason why you couldn't do an individual to find out how much Angus percentage she might have.
That is breed check is a developing product. Whether it becomes its own standalone product is still very much under discussion at the moment. But as Jake said, it's a feature of some of our genomic commercial products.
That's right. And that's right, Jen. And who knows if that will be a standard feature that all of our members can select on all cattle. Certainly in terms of the technical component, there'd be no reason why that couldn't happen, but we're just not at that stage today. Right at the moment, it's available commercially.
In terms of registering cattle, Lachlan, there's a number of different registers Angus Australia is the stewards of. One is the multi-breed register, which doesn't have to be specifically Angus. So we've got all sorts in there for people who are just trying to maintain pedigree, and also all the way up to the likes of our ultra black population. So what is it, 82.75 or whatever that percentage is, Angus. And I think to become a registered base animal, they have to be roughly 7/8. Is that right, Jake? Yeah. Lachlan had another question, which is how are the Angus cattle registered? Hair sample, ear piercing. What is the most appropriate method?
To be registered or identified? Sorry.
He's asked registered, but Lachlan, I'm assuming that you're meaning so we'll take it from a registered point of view, and then we'll take it from a genomics point of view. I think Jake would probably be the safest way to answer this question. Are you happy to talk from the registered point of view?
Yeah, so as part of registration, certainly for this question, I'd point you back to webinar 2, which is online on YouTube, because that was all about registering and identifying Angus cattle. But just briefly, in terms of the registration component, it is a requirement to have the registered Angus cattle clearly identified with 2 permanent features on that animal by the time they're 18 months, which may include an NLIS tag, a tattoo in the ear, or a freeze brand on the hide. And there's some certain requirements around that, but we do monitor those, and they are part of registering the animal. And so I suppose we've probably answered both your questions there, that the identification requirements are actually part of the registration. In terms of DNA procedures, which Andrew will take you through next webinar, but we currently receive both what we call TSUs, or tissue samples, which are very small sterile notches out of the ear, or hair follicles, hair samples, which include the follicle, and they are the 2 main ways to submit DNA. There are, of course, other options for unique circumstances where we may accept something like semen in a semen straw for a overseas sire, or something with that regard. But generally speaking, the vast majority are TSUs or hair samples. And I don't have the stats in front of me, but pretty quickly becoming more in favour of the TSU method because of the sterile nature and the storage capability of that sample. But both of our genotyping companies will accept either, and we're happy to process either.
There is occasionally, depending on which company you choose to genotype through, there is sometimes a hair surcharge just because it's a bit trickier to deal with in the lab. So some labs pass that cost on. And yeah, anyway, we'll get into this in the next webinar, I think. I hope that answers your question, Lachlan. Damien has asked, what is the interaction between NFI and growth EBVs? Would an animal with low growth EBVs but very good NFI have progeny that actually grow heavier on the same level of feed because of the greater efficiency?
Wow, I might have to study that question, to be honest with you. I think I know who Damien is too. So, no, we will. We've got all these questions recorded. I might come back to you individually on that one. I can't answer that to full detail off the top of my head. I'd have to have a look at that in more detail. But effectively, what that EBV is trying to establish is which animals are more efficient at converting that feed, and that's really around, I suppose, the traditional thoughts that quicker growing animals are more efficient, but they can actually eat more feed. So it's really about trying to identify which animals are consuming less than they were predicted to for their given performance. And given, feed cost is the number one variable cost in livestock production, it's certainly a trait that's going to come into more focus into the future, that's for sure. Anything to add there, Jen? Otherwise, I think we'll probably come back to that one in more detail offline for Damien.
Yeah. So feed intake is actually, it's like a residual feed intake value. So to put it one way is feed intake residual of weight and rate of weight gain. So it's what they consume over and above. I'm just not 100% sure of the interaction, but I know that weight and weight gain are taken into account. So it's sort of the excess over and above that. Andrew might be able to elaborate on this a little bit more.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. And yeah, Jake, just to help you out with that one. So yeah, they're completely independent of each other, Damien. So as Jen and Jake just hinted there, the net feed intake is at any given weight or rate of weight gain, what is the difference in feed intake? So in your scenario where you've got it, the animal will still be low growth. It just won't have eaten as much as it might otherwise.
Perfect. Brought in the big guns. Thanks, Andrew. That's great. Katie is our last question for this little section, unless anyone has put anything in for the in the chat. Who is responsible for recording the herd data? How do you know that this is reliable information, e.g. are the scales calibrated properly for 200-day weights?
That's a great question. And if you look at the collection guidelines on the Angus Education Centre, we do have that video and some instructions around that, and it does mention around the responsibility to have calibrated scales. But effectively, the first responsibility is for the person actually weighing the cattle to ensure that they're standing on the scales evenly, that the weight is settled when they're taking it, that they do a test weight either of themselves or an object. All of that really is the recorder's responsibility. We do, of course, have parameters set up in the system that are looking for abnormalities in the data. But given the breadth and the variation within the breed, we do see all sorts of data. But effectively, that initial responsibility lies with the recorder. And we do have some quality assurance checks along the way. But unless it was something particularly abnormal, it would be difficult for us to establish whether that was falsified or just something that was incorrect. So I suppose it's a joint process, really.
Perfect. I hope that answers your question, Katie. So Jake, that's all the questions for the moment.
Great. we've still got a bit to go, so let's keep marching. We've still got some juicy content to come, and we'll see where we end up, hey?
Perfect. If everyone has, if you have any questions, we'll just tackle them the way we have now. So yeah, don't hold back.
So for those of you that are submitting performance information to TACE or are thinking about it, I just wanted to cover also some scenarios in terms of how that information is recorded and utilised within the TACE analysis. So really what we're looking for is to establish the performance, and that's a combination of how the genetics and the environment are working together. So performance data from many different herds are submitted, and they come from a range of environments, where they be in feedlot situations, open, arid, grazing land, high alpine, snowy type country, the rolling hills of some of the better country in Australia, and then also some of the rougher scrub country as well. And so really there's some pretty vast environmental influences that must be accounted for within this TACE analysis. And the first way that the analysis does that is by forming contemporary groups. So effectively, we've got weaners, a group of weaners. Say you bring your cows and calves in for weaning on that day, and within that group, you're already going to have some heifer calves. You're going to have your bull calves. You're probably going to have some steer calves as well. So already there's 3 different ways that those animals are going to be compared, because we don't compare heifers and bulls directly because there's such a difference in the sex of those animals and what they contribute to the performance of the animal. Likewise with steers as well. Within your entire males, you might have some show team cattle that you've identified, or you might also have some sale bulls that you've picked off as young weaners to start to nurture and background in a different way. You've also got then some bulls you're going to just tip back out into the paddock A, some go to paddock B, and you'll have some sick cattle as well. So within that entire male group, you've then also got another further 4 management groups that you've identified, which are going to be compared separately. Now, this is really important because that weight that we take at weaning and how those cattle have been raised up until weaning and therefore after will actually set up the groups for comparison for a number of traits for that animal going forward. So for example, the groups that the animal has been weaned in is going to also be the groups that animal stays in terms of the evaluation for the 400-day weight, for things like scanning as well, because that influence and that environmental contribution to how that animal has performed up until that stage is actually then also going to contribute to that animal's performance going forward for the next few performance recordings as well. So really important here to not overcomplicate your groups, and really the advice here for a management group is that if there's something significant environmentally or from a management point of view that has impacted the performance of that animal, please record that as a separate management group. If it is simply that the animals have been running on the same farm and there's just a fence between them, but effectively they're running on the same pastures, they're feeding them the same, it's just effectively a wire fence between them, then you don't need to be submitting a separate management group. And so there's some criteria that is used to form contemporary groups, and some of that stuff is automatic based on who owns them, what year they were born, what date they're born, whether they're ET, like embryo or natural calves, was it a twin or a single, male or female, how old the dam was. And some of these other points are also automatic, but you also do have some influence on these things, such as when you've measured them, the measurement history, which is what I've just spoken about regarding that weaning weight, how old the calf is, and whether you've decided to keep that animal as a bull or a steer. And then when it comes back to that environmental group or that management group around, has something management or environmentally impacted the effect or the performance of this animal or this group of animals more particularly, then that's really around putting in that defined management group. So, for example, you might have a group of cows that you've had on a lease property, which isn't quite as good as your home property. You decide to wean your calves prior to Christmas, which would be likely here in the south, and you would be putting in a different management group for the calves that you have weaned from that lease property compared to your home property, because they have been under different environmental conditions and their effect on that performance record has been different, and we need to allow for that to get a true and accurate evaluation. So step 2 is that there are automatic adjustments for performance made for the known non-genetic effects, such as the age of that animal at measurement, the age of the dam or the mother, say for example at weaning. And a great example of that is a 5-year-old cow will likely have a different performance on that calf compared to a first calf heifer, and then also any breed or hybrid vigor heterosis type effects as well. So I suppose some guidelines for submitting TACE is effectively the TACE analysis is run every fortnight, and so we have a deadline which cuts off every fortnight as well. But there also are some things to take note of here, that if you're selecting or submitting any DNA samples, you really need to be allowing at least 6 to 8 weeks for those samples to be sent to Angus Australia. They are then processed within 24 hours and sent to the laboratory. We have 2 genotyping companies which will then commence working on those samples, and you will then start to get parent verifications and genetic disorders or conditions recorded on your animals. But by the time that full panel comes back to Angus Australia and is included in the TACE analysis, that could actually be 6 to 8 weeks' time. Also, if you're selecting and submitting structural information, that information is calculated with the American Angus and Canadian Angus associations, and we require that information an additional 2 weeks out from the traditional fortnight cutoff, and that's reflected in this slide around that animal registration and structural scores cutoff. The key point here is submit your information in advance to when you will require it. And that's something that we can certainly help you with, and if you require any information or further points of clarification, please contact Angus Australia for more information. So in summary, what is TACE? Well, it's a genetic evaluation used by Angus Australia to compare the genetics of Angus and Angus influenced cattle. It's run every fortnight as an analysis that evaluates the pedigree, performance and genotyping information on each animal, and it provides EBVs and selection indexes based on a non-biased evaluation of genetic influences.
Not sure there's any further questions there, Jen, otherwise we might just get into the final part of the presentation.
No, none from my end, Jake. No, I reckon we push on.
Further questions there? Otherwise, we'll just march on. The other aspect that we wanted to cover in this webinar is creating a performance recording strategy. And you're probably looking at this colourful wheel on your screen and going, this is way too complicated for me. But let's take a deep dive in and see if we can get some simple take-homes out of creating a performance recording strategy. First of all on this wheel is looking at the birth to weaning age. So the outer circumference of this wheel includes the days of age of the animal, which would be starting from 60 odd days, and we can see the numbers around the outside on this example go from 100 to 350. And we can also see those coloured bars, and what they indicate on the legend is different traits that we can actually start to collect on these animals at that time. So we can actually start to collect weaning weights at that time. We can also collect docility, and we can also start to collect some of the mature cow traits from those cows that are weaning those calves. And so this is our birth to weaning strategy. We can then also work on our weaning and yearling strategy, which goes from weaning all the way through to yearling, or from that approximately 200 days of age through to 550 days of age. And this is where we're starting to collect those 400-day weights. We can start to collect structural scores, scan data, and a lot of other different traits, including scrotal as well. And those coloured bars are indicated there on the legend. And so we can see there's a number of traits we can actually collect at the same time here. And so planning ahead is actually going to be a strategy to leave us well advanced to be able to collect the most amount of data important to us at the same time. We can then also look at the yearling to final weights, which is from that approximately 500 days of age through to over 800 days of age. And there's specific parameters about collecting and submitting performance data, which you will need to refer to. But this is really just a guide and a graphic to give us some strategy around what traits we can collect when. And we can see there's a full range of traits that we can collect at this time when that animal is approaching 2 years of age and even a bit beyond. So this is a great example of what we can do when planning ahead to collect the most amount of performance traits that we possibly can. And that's the key point here. Plan ahead, create a performance recording strategy, work out what traits are important to your herd and your business, and make sure that we collect those to the best of our possible ability. So just wanted to finish off with some of the more common performance recording problems that we see across our members, but more broadly across industry. And that's really around inadequate planning. In this scenario, you haven't planned long enough out, and this is really around getting that wall calendar out at the start of the year, putting it on the wall in the office, and working out when are the submission guidelines or the collection dates that I can collect certain traits at, and start to put them in the calendar so you can work towards making sure that you're recording the maximum amount of data from an eligible mob and animals, and then submitting that on time. So some solutions to that problem is really about becoming a proactive performance recorder and planning ahead. One of the other issues that we see is poor recording of traits of importance. So for you and your herd and your business, you might have some philosophy or principles around yearling weight is really important to you and your clients. And so it's really important that you plan to capture that yearling weight or that 400-day weight on as many animals in the larger contemporary groups as you possibly can, to ensure that that information is going into the genetic evaluation and giving you the most value back for you to make informed decisions. And so that's really around identifying those traits that are important to you and making plans to capture them and record them well ahead of time. One of the other issues we see is poor genetic linkage within your herd and also across the herd. And that's also can sometimes be similar with using only one bull. An example of that could be if you've got 100 Angus heifers and you AI them to just the one bull and you carve them all down. That all sounds fantastic, but there's really not a lot of evaluation happening between sires because you've only got the one sire represented within the calves. So it's pretty important to make sure that you're using a variety of sires that will link with other herds and also give you comparison within your herd. And so you could do things such as like mixing your cows after joining, and particularly AI females. So if you've joined in single sire contemporary groups, they don't actually calve in single sire contemporary groups. And that's just one example of some of the strategy that you could implement. One of the other issues we see is common performance recording is around unverified outliers, and this is where you've got either an exceptional performance or a suboptimal performance compared to the rest of the group that it was compared to. And what happens here is this animal is identified as an outlier, and that's the system saying, hey, there's something not quite right here. I didn't expect to see this. That could be as simple as a typo or a transcription error, or that could actually be that you have been able to breed something that has an outstanding performance, or there's been an environmental aspect such as supplementary feeding for that animal, and you haven't actually recorded a management group to allow the analysis to compare that animal fairly and without bias. So really important to get onto your outlier reports to ensure that these animals don't remain excluded from your genetic evaluation going forward. The next common performance recording problem is small contemporary groups. And this is really about trying to have the size of the contemporary group generally being larger than 10. And you can see that the benefit from this graph, the benefit of the contemporary group size starts to actually tail off after 10, meaning that if you had a group of 50 in your contemporary group, the information that you're supplying is really valuable and is going to be more than 95%, probably closer to 99% effective in terms of being able to be compared. Whereas if you have a group of 10 animals, any one of those animals is then comparable against 9 others and effectively being 90% comparable. But as soon as you get back to an animal, say in a group of 2 or 3, all of a sudden that information is only 50% effective. And so the use of that information becomes less valuable to the evaluation. So this isn't suggesting by any stretch we need to be running our contemporary groups in mobs of 200 or even 100, but certainly if you can, groups of more than 10 are definitely going to help the value that that information has in the TACE analysis. And so some of the strategies that we can implement around that small contemporary group is, say, restricting calving periods. So you get the most amount of calves born within a 6 to 8 window. You could say weigh all animals in a managed group on the same day. You could also, create management groups based on automatic criteria, which is just sex prior to management groups and prior to weaning dates. And I suppose one of the key points I'd like to make here is consider the use of genomic testing to complement any performance information that is being collected. Because as we spoke about, that genomic DNA testing will allow the analysis to pick up the genes that your animal is carrying and compare them directly to another animal within the breed that has some performance recorded on it, because it can compare the gene markers across the breed. And so that's going to be a really great strategy and certainly something that I would encourage you to implement if you're a smaller herd or by nature have to have smaller contemporary and management groups, is consider the genomic testing to complement your performance recording strategy. We've spoken about single-sire contemporary groups as well. I won't go into that any further here, but certainly try and have a variety of sires represented. That's not to say that you need to have only one calf by that sire, but if you're AIing 100 heifers, using 4 or 5 sires is certainly going to give you more evaluation than just using the 1 or 2. One of the other issues we see also is selective performance recording, and that's around that the mentality that I might only weigh some of the group. I'll only weigh the good ones and leave the lighter, poorer doing animals out. That actually doesn't help your evaluation at all, because the evaluation is looking for the difference between animals, and so to give the evaluation the most useful information, you actually need to provide the difference within that group, and that's saying the high performers and the low performers, and that then sets the parameters and I suppose the parameters for the estimation and the prediction within the TACE analysis. And so really the solution there is about adopting a whole herd recording strategy and recording all calves with Angus Australia, not just your best performers. One of the other issues we see too across industry is the inadequate performance recording, is really around people that sometimes don't believe that the system works. And we're not necessarily creating a debate on tonight's session, but what we find is that the system and the evaluation is really a best-in-class, world-leading evaluation when contemporary groups are formed correctly and the information going in has been collected and submitted within a timely fashion. And some of those other aspects that we spoke about tonight about planning ahead, large contemporary groups, and not being selective in your recording will all contribute to a higher accurate, more predictable EBV outcome after that TACE analysis. And that's really your challenge as a Angus breeder now, is to understand the importance and role of management groups, and provide management groups for those animals that have been treated differently to their peers and have performed differently due to the non-genetic factors. And if you're in any doubt about any of this, please contact Angus Australia for more advice. We are absolutely more than happy to be able to help you on your way to understanding more about this information. Another issue that we find is that despite people's best intentions and efforts, we do get pedigree errors where a calf is mismothered at birth and we haven't identified that, or there's been some joining discrepancy records, and that's really that when we do get a parent evaluation done through the use of DNA and genomics, that occasionally we will get a result come back where the father or the mother, so the sire or dam of one of the progeny, is actually not as we would thought. And that then has pretty drastic changes for the EBV prediction based on, the principles that a lot of this has been based on pedigree and what the chance of the inheritance of certain genes from the mother and father is. So when we know that it's actually from a different sire or dam, then that has some changes to the EBVs while that system is then getting updated. And one of the solutions there is really around paying ultimate attention to, your recording of pedigree information as accurately as you can. But even the best operators within the breed and indeed the industry, at times will still have discrepancies, and that's where the DNA parent verification has become so valuable. So just another consideration just for TACE as we close tonight's webinar is genomics. And we're going to talk about this in far more detail in the next session of the Angus Essentials webinar series. But we have just clicked over at Angus Australia more than 200,000 genotypes analysed in the TACE analysis every fortnight. That's coupled with 2.4 million animals that are registered and are in the evaluation every fortnight. Genomics provides comparison across animals sharing those genes. It also provides information earlier in the animal's life, provides information on hard to measure traits, and prediction on some traits close to that of a fully performance recorded herd. So I just wanted to leave you with that as a bit of an appetite and teaser for the next edition of the Angus Essentials webinar series, which will be on next month. So just some take-home messages for you guys is that the TACE EBVs for each animal are derived from actual performance data from their own performance. The performance of their relatives, the performance of animals which they share genes in common with, which is genotyping, the genetic analysis currently used. TACE is the world-leading analysis of millions of cattle every fortnight. And to get the most value out of your performance recording strategy, the herd should apply a well-thought-out strategy that includes quality measurements of large numbers of individuals for traits of importance to your herd and your clients. And for any further information on anything that we've discussed tonight, and there has been a bucket load, I make no apologies about that, but I would certainly advise you to head to the Angus Education Centre and read through the activities and modules that we've got there around understanding EBVs, indexes, research breeding values, a whole plethora of information, which is a fantastic resource for you guys to go to. And I'd certainly encourage you to head to that when you can to follow up tonight's webinar.
Rightio. Thanks everyone. Hopefully you got a bit out of that. Just before you all leave, I just would like to sincerely thank you for joining us tonight. We've gone a little bit over time, and I know life gets busy, right? So thanks for joining us, and it's great to have 30 of you live tonight. This poll is really important, so Jen just put the poll up, which we would really love you to be able to answer those questions, and it helps us reflect on how valuable you've found this webinar and what we can change about this going forward for other extension and engagement activities that Angus Australia can take. Jen, if there's any last questions, I think we should certainly see if we can answer those now. But if there's not, I'm also happy to discuss, individual things with people offline.
Thanks, Jake. There aren't any more questions at the moment. We'll just give you another few seconds to pop anything that's burning a hole in the group, in the chat. Otherwise, as Jake said, we're here to help you. Just give us a call or flick us an email. Both our details are on the Angus Australia website. Bonnie just said, thanks guys, I'm loving these webinars. Oh, thanks Bonnie. We're thrilled to have you along, Bonnie. Thank you so much for coming.
That's fantastic. Well, if there is no more questions, I just would like to thank Andrew for joining us and his contribution on the question around NFI. But also we look forward to joining Andrew next month for the genotyping session, which I know will be extremely popular. So make sure you register for that one to stay up to date. And I'd also like to thank you, Jen, for joining us and co-hosting and keeping us reasonably on track. So well done. I know that's not an easy task. And other than that, look, I hope everyone has a great week, and please, send through your questions to Jen or myself, and we will get back to you as soon as we possibly can. And thanks for joining us. Please make sure you do the poll and have a good night.
No, thanks for having us, Jake. You've done a great job, mate.